I can only imagine when that day comes, when I find myself standing in the sun. I can only imagine when all I will do is forever worship you. I can only imagine.
Hi, my name is Sindoni. Thank you for tuning in to The Road Less Traveled. Here in part 2, I will begin to share with you my personal experiences from my early childhood growing up in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in an Italian-American household with my grandparents in a two-family house on 220 Hopkins Street. I was raised as a Roman Catholic. My grandparents were of Italian descent. My grandmother was a small woman in stature. She stood less than 5 feet tall. Grandmother Teresa was born on the Mediterranean coast of Lazio, Italy, in the city of Formia. The ancient city of Formia lies approximately 90 miles from Rome. During the days of the Roman Empire, Formia became a noted seaside resort for the Roman aristocracy. My grandfather, Antonio, or Anthony as he was called, was now in his mid-70s. My grandfather was born in the province of Messina, Sicily. His family was fortunate to survive the devastating earthquake in 1908. All of my grandparents' children, with the exception of my father, were born in Italy and would later follow my grandfather to America. My grandfather was no different than any other immigrant at the time. His dream was to bring his family to America. He sought a better way of life for all of his children. But my grandmother wasn't so easily convinced. It took my grandfather approximately 9 years to convince my grandmother, but in between he was going back and forth to Italy and fathering more children. My grandfather was a man of honor. He was a good man, decent and sincere. He was opposed to individuals who would cheat, defraud, or use deception to coerce others. One of the first lessons I learned from my grandfather was that it was important to live with honor and not ruin the family name. And since I was spending a lot of time with my grandfather, I was very inquisitive about his life in Italy. My grandfather would tell me stories about his early life in Messina, Sicily. He spoke of an era before the 1920s, long before Benito Mussolini established a fascist dictatorship in the country. My grandfather spoke of his disapproval of the disastrous alliance with Adolf Hitler of Nazi Germany that led to Italy's embarrassing, crushing defeat in World War II. He taught me to use reason and logic before making any decisions, that I should not follow blindly like sheep. My grandfather knew that because of his smoking, he did not have much longer to live. I listened closely to what this great thinker had to say. It was from my grandfather that I learned to trust, but verify. I can remember coming home from school on November 22nd, 1963, when the news was announced that President Kennedy had been shot. Later that evening, I sat down with my grandfather and we watched the 6 o'clock news. After listening to the report that President Kennedy was now dead, my grandfather began shaking his head and said, "Examine the evidence and there you will discover the motive. And after examining the evidence, you will find out who is guilty of this heinous crime." My grandfather was not a conspiracy theorist. He just questioned the facts surrounding the event. In the days and weeks that followed, my cousins and uncles all spoke of the Kennedy assassination and came to the conclusion they believed that Kennedy was part of an executive execution done by a covert group within our government. This startling revelation was more than any 10-year-old can handle. But I guess I was no ordinary 10-year-old child at that time. As I remember it now, it was a shot that was heard round the world. It was in the following month of December of 1963 that my grandfather had asked me if I would like to go to Italy and accompany him to see the old world. It was then that I realized that my grandfather didn't have much longer to live. His emphysema had gotten progressively worse, and he was now coughing blood with every puff of his cigarette that he would inhale. My grandfather died abruptly before we could take this trip to Italy together. My sudden grandfather's passing hit me like a ton of bricks. I was grief-stricken for a period of 1 year after his passing. Though I knew my grandfather would no longer be suffering and he was in a better place, I began to pray for him. And it was through these prayers that I was able to get through it. As a young lad, I learned valuable lessons from my grandparents. These two wonderful people gave me the ability to love everyone unconditionally. And from my grandfather, I learned the ability to know the difference between right and wrong. And it is when you see an injustice that you use this as an opportunity to change things for the better. To take a stand and voice your opinion to change things for the betterment of humanity. And this pretty much defines who I am, who Stephen Sindoni is as a man. These early beginnings have galvanized my personality. One of the most valuable lessons in life I came away with is to know thyself. And in closing, I'd like to thank everyone for watching The Road Less Traveled, Part 2.
I can only imagine when all I will do is forever worship you. I can only imagine